Hello again, and welcome back. This is Billy with Wolf River Music Television, and this is episode number 2 of our Laurel Canyon miniseries. So you've probably already noticed that I'm standing more or less right here in about the same place that I was last time for episode 1. Well, that's because when you're here at the Canyon Country Store, you really don't have to travel very far in any direction at all before you're standing next to something that's either significant or historical. And directly behind me, of course, is the house that the legendary Jim Morrison of the Doors lived in for about 14 months of his life, from the spring of 1968 to the summer of 1969. Later on in this video, we're going to talk a lot more about Jim. We're going to talk a lot more about the Doors. We're going to talk about some of the changes that have happened to this house, and we're going to talk more about the immediate surrounding area of Love Street. Okay, but before we do any more of that, let's back up just a little bit. Let's take a closer look at some of the earliest developments and the settlement of this canyon that's north of Hollywood. This area that we now know as modern-day Los Angeles was once inhabited for centuries by as many as 10,000 Native Americans of the Tongva tribe. They led a stable existence by hunting and fishing and gathering in these canyons north of what is now present-day Hollywood and Beverly Hills. But European explorers and settlers wouldn't enter this same part of the world until 1542. When a Spanish sea expedition led by Captain Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo anchored off the coast south of what is now present-day Santa Monica. They briefly came ashore around the area of what is now the city of Long Beach, and Cabrillo claimed the land for the Crown of Spain, and he named the area Bahia de los Fumos, which in English is interpreted as the Bay of Smoke. Spain held on to this area of California for almost 280 years. And in that time, they established missions, they built roads and fortifications, and they encouraged the raising of livestock and trade with places as far away as China, Russia, and India. And they maintained business here up until 1821. When the Mexican War of Independence marked the beginning of California being governed by Mexico. By the 1930s, this canyon was mostly known for its brothels, speakeasies, and also some of the more edgy Hollywood film stars such as Errol Flynn, Orson Welles, Clara Bow, and Mary Astor. Now, she owned the home that is located at 8803 Appian Way. That home was later purchased by Denny Doherty of the Mamas and the Papas in 1966. He rented it out to the Rolling Stones in 1971 while they were all here in the Hollywood area filming a concert documentary. And according to county tax records, it appears that the home was then purchased in 1979 by none other than country music superstar Waylon Jennings. And then later, in the 1990s, it was rented out for a very short time by shock rocker Marilyn Manson, until he was chased away by what he claimed was a poltergeist. So let's go take a closer look over at this house located at 8021 Rothdale Trail. Okay, now I have seen many of the old photographs of this house from the 60s. And I really hate to disappoint anyone, but this house doesn't really look at all the way it did when Jim lived here with his girlfriend, Pamela Corson. So this house was remodeled extensively by a new owner in 1990. In fact, when Oliver Stone had his production crew out here scouting around the Los Angeles area for all of the places that were related to the Doors for his upcoming film. You know, you remember the one that was starring Val Kilmer? Well, they came out here hoping to be able to use this house, both the inside and the outside, as one of the major filming sets for many of the scenes that were in that movie. But they were completely out of luck, because at that time, the outside was completely covered by scaffolding, and the inside was being completely gutted and modernized. And this house was not going to be finished at any point that was going to work with their filming schedule, so they were not able to use this house in that movie. This house was completely remodeled again in 2012 after an arson fire on New Year's Eve 2011. Some a-hole set a Mazda Miata on fire right about here in this spot. And as you can see from the pictures, it did quite a bit of damage. But mostly back here to this area, that's an outdoor patio that's right up there. And that was almost completely destroyed. And from some of the other pictures that I've seen, it looks like it also destroyed most of the roof. Either way, the whole house had to be completely remodeled. And from the older pictures, you can see that it used to be a wood exterior that was a dark brown. And now, of course, it is this beige-colored stucco. Looks nice, but unfortunately, it doesn't look anything at all, really, the way it did back in the 60s when Jim and Pamela lived here. One thing for sure, though, that has remained a constant in this house, no matter how many times it's been damaged or remodeled, are these two balconies right here. I'm not sure which one is attached to the master bedroom, but it has been said that many times in the evening, Jim and Pam would sit out here on one of these balconies and just simply watch the people that walked around in the neighborhood, and more specifically, the people that went back and forth to the store. And as of course we know, this is where Jim got the inspiration to write the song Love Street. Unfortunately, one of the other things that is very well documented would be the relationship between Jim and Pam, which, let's see, what would be the best way to describe that? Tumultuous. It was often said that many times, especially during the summer, they would leave all the windows in this house open. And so you could hear them at times arguing, yelling at one another. And at some point, Jim would probably become exasperated and want to leave, and he would probably come out from this area right here. And as he would do that, he would be rained down upon with great vengeance from Pam in the form of his personal belongings, which would include his books, his LP records, and his clothing. Love Street, indeed. Hey, have you ever wondered what might be up on that hill back there behind that house? I know I have. So, I decided to actually go up there. There is a big long staircase that's right over here on the other side of this laundromat and the handbag and shoe repair building. And it actually even has a name. It's called Tavern Trail. And here it is, right back here. So, let's go find out what's up there. Here we go.
Jim Morrison was the single greatest rock star who has ever lived on this planet. Okay, there. I said it. And you can debate me on this subject all you want,
but I am not going to change my stance on that one. Now, I didn't say greatest musician. I didn't say greatest singer. I didn't even say greatest lyricist. What I said was greatest rock star. Jim possessed all the hallmarks of the quintessential rock star. He was physically beautiful, and even though it took a little bit of time, he finally developed enough confidence in his abilities to not only lead this rock band called The Doors, but essentially, he came to define the very essence of that band, and he learned to relish the spotlight. He turned the idea of manipulating a crowd into an art form in a way that no one else ever had before him. He was alarming, he was dangerous, and he was utterly unpredictable in public settings. His charisma was absolutely mesmerizing. Unfortunately, for most people who either weren't around or just were too young to remember the Doors in their heyday, the only real personification that they have of Jim Morrison has probably come from the Oliver Stone movie that was released in 1991, 20 years after Jim's death. This film tends to dwell mostly on the negative aspects of Jim's complicated personality, and portrays him as not only a ridiculous drunk, but also as a narcissist, cruel and petty. But those who actually knew him well described him in a much different way. By the way, speaking of that movie, the rest of the Doors hated it. If you want to see a work of fiction that's really entertaining, go watch the Oliver Stone film. But if you want to get the real truth of what was actually going on back during those years, you're going to have to go and listen to some of the interviews by the other members of the Doors. They were there, and they'll tell you what was really going on. So just to give you an idea of where Jim Morrison was in his life during the time period that he lived in this house between the spring of 1968 and July of 1969. This was the time period where they were still writing and recording material for their third album, which of course was Waiting for the Sun, which was a very successful album for them. But during that time between July of 1968, when that album came out, and July of 1969, when the fourth album finally came out, which of course was The Soft Parade, this was a very difficult time in Jim's life. He was experiencing a lot of legal issues. Almost all of those, of course, were self-imposed, and he was very distracted from what he was doing. In fact, he was having a very difficult time even writing material for The Soft Parade. In the early days of the Doors, Jim Morrison made it very clear to the other members of the band that he did not consider himself to be a musician. He considered himself to be a writer and a poet, and he needed other people to help him put his words and his ideas and his poetry to music. Now, this meant that he wanted all credit, regardless of who wrote the words, who wrote the music, to be credited to all the Doors, no matter what. It was an all for one for all kind of mentality. They also had a very special agreement amongst themselves that if one single person disagreed with any decision, then that person had veto power over all the others. That meant all four Doors had to agree to every single thing that they did, regardless of what it was, where they went, what they recorded. Didn't matter. They all had to agree. So if we fast forward now to that time period right before the fourth album, The Soft Parade, came out, unfortunately some things happened to that agreement. And mainly it involved the fact that Jim was having a very difficult time writing material. He often wouldn't show up to recording sessions. He would disappear for days at a time. They would just carry on without him. So Robbie Krieger stepped up and started writing more material because they needed it. Now the problem was that Jim wasn't really terribly fond of some of the material that Robbie had been writing, and he sang it reluctantly, but he told the rest of the Doors that at this point, I want to make sure that people know what material I wrote lyrically and what material Robbie Krieger wrote. He wanted to make that distinction. So there were already chinks in the armor that were starting to form, and the downfall of the Doors at that point probably was beginning. That would have been the summer of 1969.
Now, contrary to what some might want to believe, the Doors were not an instant success. Jim was not a vocalist or a band leader by nature. He was introverted, and he was shy in front of a crowd, often standing with his back to the audience, and sometimes even with his head down. And just as a side note, it was sometime during these early formative years that Jim would wind up meeting his life companion, Pamela Corson, at a Doors gig in LA. It took about a year for Jim to finally get comfortable on stage, and then his confidence began to grow. Meanwhile, the Doors managed to get themselves booked at the Whiskey A Go-Go in West Hollywood as the opening act and the house band, starting in the summer of 1966. Even then, the Doors were a confusing act to most audiences in Los Angeles at that time. Their lyrics were dark and they were odd, and Jim was often tripping on acid while he was on stage. And eventually, Morrison's on-stage antics, including the time he infamously screamed out, "Mother, I want to f*** you," during a live performance of The End, got the band fired from their gig at the Whiskey A Go-Go. But not before Jack Holtzman of Elektra Records had seen them and decided to sign them to a record deal on November 15th of 1966. Now, just before Jim and the Doors had managed to get themselves fired from the Whiskey, Jim Morrison met the other Morrison, as in Van Morrison. And so, these two seemed to hit it off quite well and rather quickly, and they even sang a couple of songs together at a show on Van's final night in Los Angeles with his band, Them. And it is no coincidence that immediately after this very famous meeting of the two Morrisons and their brief time together at the whiskey that Jim really seemed like he began coming out of his shell. According to Ray Manzarek, in a 1983 interview, he said that Jim began to almost mimic, in many ways, Van Morrison's reckless and seemingly improvised stage persona, such as holding the mic stand upside down before slamming it down on the stage, or crouching down really low and reciting improvised poetry to nothing more than just a simple drum beat.
I'm wondering if actually back here is the entrance to that storage room that's below. Earlier we had talked about Cass Elliot and how she was given a key so that she would not have to come through the store every single time and go down the stairs, which would definitely be right there. Hey everybody, I want to give you another big thanks for sticking around and watching all of episode 2. I want you to come back and join us again for episode 3. We're gonna kind of leave this general area here that we've been at so long, which would be the Canyon Country Store, and we're gonna head across the street into an area that the locals know as the Kirkwood Bowl. So please subscribe to our channel so that you'll always know when new videos are coming out. Once again, this is Billy with Wolf River Music Television. Have a great rest of your day. Now, we're gonna talk a lot more about Jim and this house. Now, later on in this video, we're gonna talk more in depth about Jim Morrison and the Doors, and we're gonna talk a lot more about this house and some of the things that happened here. So later on in this video, we're gonna talk more about Jim Morrison. We're gonna talk more about the Doors.